Every morning, Daniel woke up before the sun. Not out of exemplary discipline, but out of old habit. At 52, his body already knew the time, even when his mind wanted to stay in bed a little longer. He would sit on the edge of the mattress, take a deep breath, and wait for the pain in his back to subside enough so he could stand up. He didn't complain. He never complained. He just waited. The house was simple, small, too quiet for someone who still had a teenage son living there. The boys' room was at the end of the hallway. Door closed. Always closed. Daniel respected that space, even though he missed the conversations that no longer existed. In the kitchen, coffee was made slowly. He liked the sound of water boiling, the smell rising. It was the most peaceful moment of the day. An instant when life seemed under control. For almost 30 years, Daniel had been a carpenter. Self-employed. No boss, no luxury. He built doors, tables, cabinets. Wood was predictable. If you treated it well, it responded. Unlike people. Unlike life. Before, he would leave early, carry his tools, spend the day on his feet. He'd come back tired, but satisfied. Money never left over, but it was always enough. It was sufficient. Now, everything was different. The back pain didn't appear all at once. It came gradually. First a discomfort, then a limitation. Until the day he tried to lift a piece of wood and simply fell to his knees on the workshop floor. Since then, the work stopped. And with work came fear. Daniel didn't talk about it with anyone. Not even with his son. He didn't want to seem weak. He had already failed at marriage. He couldn't fail as a father too. He looked at the bills on the kitchen table, organized in small piles, as if that made everything less scary. Rent, electricity, food, school. For the first time in decades, Daniel didn't know what would come next. And the silence of the house on that ordinary morning seemed heavier than any wood he had ever carried. Before the pain, before the fear, Daniel's days followed a simple rhythm. He would wake up early, put on his shirt already stained with sawdust, and go straight to the makeshift workshop in the backyard. It wasn't big, but it was his. Each tool had a story. Each mark on the workbench, a mistake that became a lesson. He worked alone. He always had. He liked the silence broken only by the sound of wood being cut. There, he had control. He knew how to measure, adjust, fix. He knew how to make something with his own hands. That had always been enough to feel useful. In the late afternoon, he would clean the workshop and enter the house when the sky began to darken. His son, Lucas, was usually in his room, headphones on, the whole world inside a screen. The conversations between them had gotten shorter over time. Not for lack of love, but for lack of words. Daniel would make dinner. Something simple. Rice, beans, meat when possible. They ate together, almost always in silence. Sometimes they talked about school, about some small problem. Daniel listened more than he spoke. He wanted to be present, even without knowing exactly how. The separation still hurt. Not because of the end of the marriage itself, but because of the feeling of not having been able to keep the family whole. He never spoke badly of Lucas's mother. He didn't want his son to carry grudges that weren't his. Being a father after 50 wasn't easy. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility every day. He didn't have a plan B. He didn't have savings. He only had his work and the will to make it work. And for a long time, it did. But when his body began to fail, Daniel realized something he had never admitted. His entire identity was tied to what he could no longer do. And without work, he began to wonder who he was, after all. The day Daniel understood he could no longer ignore the pain was too ordinary to be unforgettable. There was no serious accident, no ambulance. Just a wrong movement. One extra effort. And his body simply gave out. He sat on the workshop floor for a long time, looking at his own hands. Strong hands, calloused, that had always solved everything. At that moment, they were useless. The following days were strange. Without work, time seemed to stand still. Daniel walked around the house slowly, as if afraid to make noise. He avoided the workshop. He avoided looking at the tools. Each hammer, each saw, reminded him of everything he could no longer do. The bills began to fall behind. First one, then another. Daniel tried to do calculations in his head, looking for solutions that didn't exist. He thought about selling tools. He thought about borrowing money. He thought about many things he had never thought about before. At night, when the house slept, he stayed awake. His body tired, his mind full. He thought about his son. He thought about the future. He thought about what would happen if nothing changed. The loneliness didn't come from lack of people, but from the feeling of no longer being necessary. Daniel had always believed that a man needed to support his own household. Now, that certainty weighed like guilt. It was Lucas who noticed first. One day, seeing his father sitting at the table, staring at the bills, the boy stopped at the kitchen door. "Are you okay?" he asked, not knowing how to ask. Daniel wanted to lie. He wanted to say yes, that everything was under control. But something in him was too tired to pretend. "Not really," he answered. It was the first time he had admitted it out loud. And without realizing it, that simple moment opened a door that Daniel had never had the courage to touch. After that brief conversation with his son, something changed. It wasn't relief. It wasn't immediate hope. It was just the feeling that hiding fear no longer made sense. Daniel had always believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness. He grew up watching men swallow problems in silence. He had always done the same. But now, over 50 years old, without work and in constant pain, silence was becoming dangerous. It was on an ordinary morning that he decided to leave the house. Not to look for work. Not to solve everything. Just to breathe outside those walls. He walked slowly to the neighborhood community center. A simple place where classes, meetings, small activities took place. He had passed by there many times without ever going in. At the reception, he stood still for a few seconds, not knowing what to say. He felt ashamed. A man his age, without answers, without direction. "Can I help you?" asked a woman behind the counter. Daniel took a deep breath. I'm a carpenter. Or I was. I can't work like before anymore. But I know how to teach." The words came out with difficulty. It wasn't a request for money. It was something worse for him, admitting he needed direction. The woman listened attentively. She said they were looking for someone to teach basic woodworking classes to young people and adults. Nothing permanent. A few hours a week. A small beginning. Daniel left there with a paper in his hand and one less weight on his chest. There was still fear. There was still pain. But for the first time in months, there was a next step. On the first day of class, he almost gave up. He thought no one would show up. He thought he no longer had value to teach anything to anyone. But people came. A few. Curious looks. Inexperienced hands. Simple expectations. When Daniel began to explain, something familiar happened. His body ached, but his voice was steady. His hands could no longer lift weight, but they still knew how to guide. And at the end of that morning, he realized something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was still useful. Daniel didn't call it a fresh start. For him, it was just what came next. A small step, without promises too big. The classes at the community center didn't solve all the problems. The money was little. The back pain continued. The bills still demanded attention. But gradually, something inside him began to adjust. The students came back. Some told stories similar to his. Ordinary people, trying to find some meaning in the midst of exhaustion. Daniel listened, taught, corrected with patience. He wasn't just showing how to cut wood. He was showing how not to give up. At home, the atmosphere also changed. Lucas appeared more in the kitchen. He asked questions. Sometimes he just stayed there in silence, next to his father. Daniel realized he didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to be present. At 55, Daniel didn't build a new company. He didn't get rich. He didn't become an example of extraordinary success. But he built something more discreet and profound. He built trust. He built dignity. He built a new way of seeing himself. He understood that a man's value isn't only in how much he produces, but in what he shares. That asking for help doesn't erase a lifetime of effort. And that starting over after 50 isn't going back to the beginning. It's moving forward with more truth. In the workshop, now almost empty, Daniel still kept some tools. Not as a reminder of what he lost, but as proof of what he lived. And every morning when the sun rose, he continued waking up early. Not out of old habit, but by choice. Because even ordinary lives, when they don't give up, find extraordinary meaning after 50. If this story touched you, don't scroll away just yet. There are many men over 50 who feel invisible, lost, or unsure if it's too late to begin again. If this story made you feel less alone, consider subscribing to Men After 50 Stories. And if you're comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.